A millionaire businessman, ambitious and skeptical, seeks answers about his life. But when he meets Padre Pio, he receives an unexpected prophecy that changes everything. What was revealed left him speechless. The solid gold clock on the office wall marked exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, when Howard Davis signed his last document as president of the business empire his family had built over generations. His hands, always firm and decisive, trembled slightly as the pen slid across the paper. The office, located on the top floor of the imposing building in the heart of New York City's financial district, still maintained the air of power that had always characterized it, but now it seemed suffocating. Through the enormous glass windows, the city stretched out like an empire that had once been his. Howard adjusted his Italian silk tie and tried to maintain the composure that his 52 years of privilege had taught him. In the reflection of the glass, he observed his face marked by time and the stress of recent months, deep circles under his eyes beginning to betray the sleepless nights, worried about the news that came from all sides. "Mr. Davis, the lawyers, are waiting in the meeting room," announced his secretary Miranda, with a voice that mixed pity and embarrassment. She had been working by his side for 20 years, and for the first time couldn't look directly into his eyes. The businessman took a deep breath, adjusted his impeccably tailored Armani suit, and walked down the corridor he had traversed so many times as the owner of that empire. Each step echoed as a bitter reminder of what he was about to lose. The walls, decorated with rare works of art and business achievement certificates, seemed to mock his current situation. In the meeting room, familiar faces awaited him with grave expressions. Among them, he recognized Richard Mitchell, his oldest partner and until a few months ago his closest friend. Now Richard avoided his gaze, focusing on the papers spread across the mahogany table. "The documents are already prepared, Howard," said Dr. Carter, the lawyer who used to defend his interests and now represented the creditors. "It's best to resolve this in the most discreet way possible." The words sounded like a death sentence for everything Howard had built. The debts, the lawsuits, the accusations of mismanagement. Everything had accumulated like a silent avalanche that now completely engulfed him. His signature on those papers meant the transfer of control of all the group's companies to a consortium of creditors. "How did this happen, Richard?" Howard asked, his voice heavy with bitterness. "We were partners for more than 2 decades. Richard finally raised his eyes, but his gaze was cold, calculating. "Times have changed, my friend. You refused to see the signs. You continued spending as if money were infinite, ignored my warnings about market changes." The truth was even more painful. While Howard maintained his life of luxury and ostentation, Richard had meticulously orchestrated his downfall, secret. Meetings with investors, manipulation of financial reports, diversion of important clients, a complex plot that only revealed itself when it was already too late. After signing the last page, Howard remained seated, observing his hands that now visibly trembled. The room gradually emptied until only Miranda remained at the door, hesitant. "Mr. Davis, your driver is waiting downstairs," she said softly. "That won't be necessary anymore, Miranda," he replied, rising with difficulty. "From today on, I learned to walk alone." Upon leaving the building, Howard felt the weight of 52 years of privilege crumbling on his shoulders. The Rolex on his wrist now marked 4:40 in the afternoon, a time when he would normally be discussing business strategies in his air-conditioned office. Instead, he found himself standing on the sidewalk, observing the movement of the city that never stops. His credit cards were already blocked, his bank accounts frozen. In his pocket, only a few crumpled bills and the keys to an apartment that, he knew, would not be his for much longer. The debt collection process would follow its course, and soon he would also lose his last refuge. Night was beginning to fall over New York City when Howard finally arrived at his apartment in the Upper East Side. The doorman, who always greeted him with deference, now only observed in silence as he crossed the lobby. Inside the mirrored elevator, Howard barely recognized the man who stared back at him, a ghost of himself, carrying on his shoulders the weight of a crumbling empire. Upon opening the apartment door, he found a brown envelope on the living room table. Inside it, A judicial notification informed him that his assets were under inventory and that he should vacate the property within 48 hours. It was the beginning of a fall that promised to be even deeper and more painful than he could imagine. The 48 hours passed like a bitter breath. Howard observed the moving company employees emptying his apartment, carrying away pieces of art, designer furniture, and memories of a lifetime. Each object removed seemed to take with it a piece of his identity. The sound of Italian shoes against the marble floor echoed differently now, no longer as the steps of a powerful man, but as the last gasps of an era coming to an end. The next morning, wearing one of his last suits that he had managed to pack into a single suitcase, Howard tried to contact people he considered friends. His cell phone, still working for a few days before being cut off, became an instrument of humiliation. Messages went unanswered, calls went to voicemail. Numbers that were once answered on the first ring now seemed to no longer exist. His sister Barbara was the only one who answered. "Do you have any idea of the shame you're making us go through?" were her first words, cutting like razors. "Mum is devastated, can barely leave the house. People comment point. Our family name has become a subject of gossip at the clubs. Barbara, I just need a place to stay for a few weeks until I can get back on my feet," Howard tried to explain, swallowing what pride he had left. "Impossible, Howard. George has made it clear he doesn't want you near our house. We have 2 young children, a reputation to maintain. You should have thought about that before losing everything in such a shameful way." The call ended with a dry click, leaving only silence as an answer. Howard remained standing in the building lobby, observing the suitcase at his side, all that remained of a life of luxury and ostentation. The doorman discreetly avoided looking in his direction. With resources rapidly dwindling, Howard sought shelter in a modest hotel in the center of the city. The small room with peeling wallpaper and a noisy air conditioner was a brutal contrast to the penthouse he had just left. On the first night, he couldn't sleep. The noise of traffic outside mixed with his turbulent thoughts. News about his bankruptcy was already circulating in newspapers and financial websites. "Davis Empire crumbles under accusations of mismanagement," announced the headlines. Malicious comments on social networks, old photos of luxurious parties now used to illustrate articles about his downfall. Each new discovery was like a dagger in his pride. On the 3rd day at the hotel, his credit card was declined. The manager, a short man with thick glasses, approached with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Davis, but without payment guarantee, we can't keep you accommodated." That night, for the first time in his life, Howard experienced the real weight of loneliness. Sitting on a bench in Union Square, with his suitcase beside him and only a few $100s in his pocket, he observed the city that never slept continue its routine, indifferent to his personal drama. His cell phone rang one last time. It was his ex-wife, Christine. "Our son doesn't want to use your last name at school anymore, Howard," she said, her voice mixing anger and disappointment. "Luke is being targeted for jokes. The other parents don't want their children near him. How could you do this to us?" Christine's words penetrated deep into his heart. Luke, his 15-year-old son, had always been his greatest pride. Now he didn't even want to carry his name. "Can I talk to him?" he asked, his voice breaking. "He doesn't want to. He said you died to him the day he saw your name splashed across the newspapers. Please don't contact us anymore. We need to rebuild our lives away from your failure." The night advanced, bringing with it a fine, cold drizzle typical of New York City. Howard remained seated, letting the water run down his face, mixing with tears that, for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to shed. His suit, once impeccable, was now wrinkled and damp. A group of homeless people approached, occupying other benches in the square. Howard observed them with a mixture of fear and fascination. Those people whom he had barely noticed through the tinted windows of his Mercedes now seemed to share his reality. Suddenly, one of the men approached, offering a piece of cardboard. "The night's going to be cold, boss," he said in a hoarse voice. "This helps protect from the wet ground." Howard looked at the cardboard extended in his direction, feeling the world spin around him. Was this then his new place in the world? The man who once commanded a business empire now receiving charity from a stranger in the square. The early morning dragged on when Howard finally accepted the cardboard, lying down in a less exposed corner of the square. The noise of cars and the lights of the big city lulled his restless sleep, while in his mind echoed the words of all who had abandoned him. His world had completely collapsed, but he still didn't know that the true rock bottom was yet to come. The first rays of sun found Howard huddled on the park bench, his suit soaked by the overnight drizzle. His back ached from contact with the hard surface, and his muscles protested against the cold that had penetrated to his bones. Beside him, the suitcase with his last belongings was wet, as was the cardboard that had served as a precarious protection during the night. The city's movement started early. Street vendors set up their stalls, hurried executives past carrying their briefcases, and some homeless people, his new involuntary sleeping companions, began to disperse. Howard tried to get up, feeling each joint complain at the effort. His stomach revealed that it had been almost 24 hours since his last meal. With the few bills he still carried in his pocket, he entered a modest bakery. The smell of fresh bread hit him like a distant memory of breakfasts in his penthouse. He ordered a simple coffee and a grilled sandwich, sitting in a discreet corner. His clothes, once elegant, now betrayed his situation, wrinkled, dirty, and damp. "Are you all right, sir?" asked the waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. There was something in her gaze that wasn't pity, but a genuine concern that made his heart ache even more. "I am," he replied dryly, avoiding prolonging the conversation. Each word of kindness was like a needle in his wounded pride. After coffee, he wandered aimlessly through the downtown streets. His suitcase, once light, now seemed to weigh tons. He entered some businesses trying to speak with old contacts, but security guards wouldn't even let him past reception. His name, once a password for open doors, was now a reason for suspicious looks and polite refusals. In the late afternoon, he sat on the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral, observing the comings and goings of people. A group of pigeons disputed crumbs near his feet, oblivious to his presence. The sun began to set, painting the sky in orange hues that reflected in the windows of the surrounding buildings. That's when he noticed suspicious movement near his suitcase. Two men, appearing to be homeless, were approaching stealthily. Before he could react, one of them grabbed his baggage and ran off, while the other pushed him violently against the stone steps. "No, please," shouted Howard, trying to stand up and run after the thieves. But his dress shoes, unsuitable for such a chase, made him stumble. He fell to his knees on the rough ground, tearing his suit pants and injuring his skin. People around observed the scene with a mixture of indifference and embarrassment. No one moved to help. Howard remained there, fallen, watching his last belongings disappear into the crowd, his last decent clothes, documents, and the few family photographs he had managed to save. Night came, bringing a heavier rain. With nowhere to go, and now without his belongings, Howard sought shelter under the awning of a closed store. His stomach ached with hunger, but the money that remained would barely cover a meal. He needed to economize. A group of homeless people took shelter further down, sharing a bottle of cheap liquor. One of them called him with a wave, offering a sip. Howard, who before only drank the best wines and whiskies, hesitated for a moment. But the cold and pain in his body spoke louder. The liquid went down, burning his throat, bringing momentary warmth and a dizziness that, paradoxically, brought some comfort. It was easier to bear reality with dulled senses. "First night?" asked one of the men, an old man with a grizzled beard and sunken eyes. Howard merely nodded, unable to form words. "We get used to it," continued the man. "But never completely. Each day is a struggle." The words sounded like a dark prophecy. Was this his destiny now? To get used to life on the streets, depending on the charity of others and sharing drinks with strangers? The early morning advanced. When the rain finally gave a truce, the group dispersed, leaving Howard alone with his thoughts. His body trembled, partly from the cold, partly from the effects of the cheap liquor. He closed his eyes, trying to find some consolation in sleep, but the images of the day wouldn't stop tormenting him. The suitcase being stolen, the looks of contempt, the shame of his fall. On the wet sidewalk, reflections of the city lights formed colorful puddles. Howard observed his distorted reflection in one of them, barely recognizing the man who stared back at him. His hair, always well trimmed, was now disheveled and dirty. The stubble began to appear, and his eyes carried a weight that no sleep could alleviate. A siren sound in the distance made him huddle even more against the wall. The night promised to be long, and dawn would bring new challenges that he still couldn't imagine. At that moment, alone and stripped of everything, Howard Davis was just one more among the thousands of invisible people who populated the streets of the big city. A week passed on the streets of New York City. Howard's suit, once a symbol of power and elegance, was now nothing more than a set of dirty and torn fabrics. His beard, always meticulously trimmed, had grown irregular and unkempt. The man who once occupied economic headlines now blended in with the hundreds of homeless people wandering through the city center. Hunger was his constant companion. The few coins he managed to get were guarded zealously, each cent weighing between the need to eat and to maintain some reserve for emergencies. He had learned to identify the times when bakeries discarded bread from the previous day and had discovered some restaurants that, out of pity, offered food leftovers at the end of their business day. On that particularly cold morning, Howard walked along Fifth Avenue, observing his old world through a new perspective. People passed by hurriedly, checking their expensive watches and talking on cell phones about meetings and appointments, a reality that now seemed to belong to another life. That's when he spotted Richard Mitchell, his former partner, coming out of one of the commercial buildings. He was impeccable in his Italian suit, talking animatedly with two executives. For a moment, their gazes crossed. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flash of recognition passing through his eyes, but soon averted his gaze and continued his conversation as if he had seen nothing. "Hey, Richard!" Howard shouted, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "Richard Mitchell!" People around began to look, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. Richard quickened his pace toward his imported car, pretending not to hear the increasingly desperate calls. "You planned it all, didn't you?" Howard continued shouting, following him. "How long did it take to architect my ruin? How many secret meetings? How many falsified documents?" Two security guards from the building approached quickly, holding Howard by the arms. "Sir, you need to leave," one of them said firmly. "You don't understand," Howard tried to explain, his voice breaking. "That man, he destroyed my life." "If you don't calm down, we'll call the police," threatened the other guard, pushing him away from the building entrance. Howard stumbled backward, feeling the weight of another humiliation. Richard had already gotten into his car and departed, leaving only the exhaust smoke as a response. The people who witnessed the scene soon returned to their affairs, and he once again became invisible. Dragging his feet, he walked to a small park nearby. His stomach ached with hunger. He hadn't eaten anything since the night before, when he had managed to get some pieces of bread from a bakery. He sat on a bench, watching children play under the supervision of their nannies. One of them vaguely resembled his son Luke. Tears began to silently stream down his dirty face. He thought of Luke, now ashamed to carry his surname. He thought of his ex-wife Christine, of his sister Barbara, of his mother, all the people who now considered him dead. In a few months, he had transformed from a respected patriarch into a shame for the family. The sun was beginning to set when an elderly woman approached his bench. She was one of the street vendors he used to see around, carrying a basket with pastries. "You haven't eaten anything today, have you?" she asked, her voice carrying a southern accent. "You've been on this bench since early morning." Before he could answer, she took a pastry from the basket and offered it to him. "I can't give much, as I need to sell to support myself, but nobody deserves to go hungry." Howard took the pastry with trembling hands, fighting against the knot forming in his throat. "Thank you," he whispered, feeling the warmth of the food in his hands. "You know," continued the woman, adjusting her basket, "sometimes life takes everything from us to teach us something. The hard part is understanding the lesson amid the pain." She walked away, leaving Howard with his thoughts. The pastry, which in another life he wouldn't have even considered eating, now seemed the most precious of meals. Each bite was a reminder of how his life had changed, of how the small gestures of kindness he once despised now meant everything. Night came, bringing with it a fine drizzle. Howard sought shelter under a nearby awning, which already served as a roof for other homeless people. One of them recognized him from the news. "Aren't you that businessman who lost everything?" he asked with genuine curiosity. Howard merely nodded, unable to elaborate an answer. The man laughed without humor. "Welcome to the Club of the Forgotten. Doc, down here all titles are equal." The words echoed in his mind as he tried to find a comfortable position on the hard ground. Tomorrow would be another day of struggle for survival, another day trying to maintain his dignity in a world that seemed determined to completely strip it away. The New York winter showed its cruelest face that early morning. The temperature had plummeted to the low 40s, and the cutting wind transformed the drizzle into icy needles that penetrated to the bone. Howard, huddled under a piece of soaked cardboard, trembled uncontrollably. His body, accustomed to the comfort of central heating and goose-down comforters, now desperately fought against the cold of the streets. The cough started 3 days ago, first as a slight discomfort, then transforming into a constant battle for air. Each spasm shook his thin and debilitated body, bringing with it a sharp pain in the chest. The fever came and went, leaving him in a state of semi-consciousness where present and past mixed in an endless nightmare. "You need to go to the hospital, mister," insisted Mrs. Sophie, the same street vendor who days before had offered him a pastry. She passed by there every morning on her way to her selling spot and, in recent days, observed with growing concern Howard's deteriorating state. But he refused. The fear of being recognized, of becoming a headline again, ex-millionaire businessman hospitalized as indigent, was greater than the survival instinct. Besides, he had no documents. His papers had disappeared along with the stolen suitcase, and the idea of trying to explain his situation to overworked public employees seemed an additional humiliation he wasn't ready to face. In his feverish delirium, memories danced like shadows on the wall. He saw himself again in his office, signing million-dollar contracts. He saw his son Luke running through the corridors of the mansion, his laughter echoing like music. He saw his mother, proud, showing his photo on the cover of the business magazine to her club friends. "Dad, Dad," Luke's voice echoed in his mind as the fever rose. "Why did you do this to us?" Reality and hallucinations mixed more and more. On one of those nights, he thought he had seen Richard Mitchell standing in front of him, smiling with disdain. "You were never one of us, Howard," said the ghost of his former partner. "You were always an imposter playing at being important with the money your father built." The cough worsened each day, transforming into a painful symphony that prevented him from sleeping. Other homeless people began to move away, fearing it might be something contagious. Loneliness, already his constant companion, became even deeper. It was on one of those nights of high fever that Howard began to delirious more intensely. In his mind, he was back in the meeting room where everything began to crumble. But this time, he clearly saw the signs he had ignored, the looks exchanged between the partners, the documents with suspicious clauses, the numbers that never completely added up. "You need to eat, sir," insisted Mrs. Sophie, who now stopped twice a day to check on him. She left a cup of hot coffee and pieces of bread, but Howard could barely swallow. The taste of food had transformed into ashes in his mouth. On a particularly cold morning, Howard woke up with a searing pain in his chest. Each breath was a battle, and the world around him spun in a kaleidoscope of distorted colors and sounds. He tried to stand up, but his legs didn't respond. The cardboard under his body was soaked with sweat despite the intense cold. "My God in heaven," shouted Mrs. Sophie upon finding him in that state. "Call an ambulance! Someone call an ambulance!" Howard wanted to protest, to say he was fine, that he didn't need help, but his voice had transformed into a hoarse whisper, and the words were lost before they reached his lips. The world began to darken at the edges, like an old photograph fading. In his last moments of consciousness, he saw himself again in his old office. The gold clock on the wall marked 3:15, the same time he had signed his surrender. But now, through the fog of fever, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: a small monastery across the street, its windows illuminated like a beacon in the darkness. "Hang in there, mister." Mrs. Sophie's voice sounded distant, as if coming from another world. "The ambulance is already coming." The sound of the siren grew in the background, mixing with the concerned voices around him. Howard tried to keep his eyes open, but the weight on his eyelids was too great. Before completely losing consciousness, a crystalline thought crossed his feverish mind. Perhaps some falls were necessary to learn to rise in a different way. The smell of hospital disinfectant was the first thing Howard perceived upon regaining consciousness. His eyes, heavy and sensitive to the fluorescent light, took time to adjust to the aseptic environment of the collective room. An IV dripped slowly into his left arm, and the rhythmic sound of the heart monitor marked the passage of time. "You gave us quite a scare," said a middle-aged nurse, adjusting the pillow under his head. "Severe pneumonia, malnutrition, dehydration. If it weren't for that lady who called the ambulance, you might not be here anymore." Howard tried to speak, but his throat was dry and painful. The nurse offered a cup of water, helping him. "Drink through a straw." The cool liquid went down like a balm, but each sip was a considerable effort. "We need your information for the record," she continued, holding a clipboard. "You're without documents, and nobody could inform us." He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of shame. How to explain that a few weeks ago he was the owner of a business empire? How to say his name without it becoming another humiliating chapter of his fall? "Howard," he finally whispered. "Howard Davis." The nurse stopped writing, her eyes widening in recognition. "The businessman, the one from the news?" Before he could respond, a movement at the door of the room caught his attention. Mrs. Sophie was there, her tired face showing genuine concern. Beside her, to Howard's surprise, was his son, Luke. The teenager seemed to have aged years since the last time he had seen him. His eyes, once bright and carefree, now carried a premature seriousness. He wore the uniform of the private school where he studied, but his posture was tense, as if ready to flee at any moment. "This lady came looking for me at school," explained Luke, his voice breaking. "Said my father was dying in a public hospital." Mrs. Sophie stepped forward, her hands nervously twisting the handkerchief she carried. "Forgive the intrusion, Mr. Howard, but I saw the boy's photo in your wallet before it was stolen. I recognized the school uniform." The nurse, sensing the delicacy of the moment, discreetly withdrew from the room. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken words, and contained emotions. "Why didn't you reach out to us?" Luke finally asked. "Why did you prefer to live on the street rather than ask for help?" "Your father is a very proud man," intervened Mrs. Sophie, her voice soft. "Sometimes pride is the last thing we have left, even if it destroys us from within." Howard felt tears running down his thin, pale face. He wanted to hug his son, to say he was sorry, that he would give anything to go back in time and do things differently. But his weak body could barely move in the hospital bed. "Mom doesn't know I'm here," continued Luke. She's still very hurt by everything that happened." "I know," responded Howard, his voice no more than a whisper. "I destroyed our family." "You destroyed much more than that." Richard Mitchell's voice cut through the air like a razor. He was standing at the door of the room, impeccable in his navy blue suit, a folder of documents under his arm. Luke instinctively moved closer to his father's bed, as if wanting to protect him. Mrs. Sophie took a step back, feeling the tension grow in the environment. "I came as soon as I heard you were hospitalized," continued Richard, entering the room. "We need to resolve some legal issues. Your hospitalization is generating costs for the public system, and considering your debts." "Have you no shame?" interrupted Mrs. Sophie, her voice trembling with indignation. "A sick man, almost dead, and you come to talk about money." Richard cast a look of disdain at the elderly woman. "Don't meddle in matters that don't concern you. This is a business issue." "Business?" Luke's voice sounded surprisingly adult. "Is that what you call destroying your ex-partner's life? My father's?" The heart monitor began to beep more rapidly. Howard felt his heart accelerate, air again lacking in his lungs. A new wave of coughing attacked him, making his body violently tremble. "Everyone out of here!" ordered a doctor, quickly entering the room. "He's still too weak for this kind of stress." While the medical team surrounded him, Howard saw through his blurred vision his son being led outside by Mrs. Sophie and Richard disappearing down the corridor, leaving behind only the echo of his firm steps on the hospital floor. The last thing he registered before sinking back into unconsciousness was the worried face of his son and the distant voice of Mrs. Sophie praying quietly. In his delirium, the image of the small monastery returned to his mind, its illuminated windows blinking like a code he still couldn't decipher. Recovery in the hospital was slow and painful. For 2 weeks, Howard fought against the pneumonia that had almost taken his life. The doctors said his body was extremely debilitated by poor nutrition and nights in the open, which made the healing process more difficult. In the long hours of solitude, between one nursing visit and another, he reflected on how his life had transformed into a succession of losses. Mrs. Sophie appeared every day, always bringing a word of comfort and sometimes some fruit or a piece of homemade cake that she prepared especially for him. Her constant presence was like a beacon of hope amid the darkness that surrounded him. "The boy asked about you today," she said on a particularly grey afternoon, while carefully peeling an orange. "He passes by the hospital every day after school, but doesn't have the courage to come." Toistsa, Luke hadn't returned since that first turbulent encounter, but Mrs. Sophie had transformed into an unlikely bridge between father and son. Through her, Howard learned that the boy had been thoughtful, that his grades had dropped in school, that he spent hours looking at old family photos. "He suffers as much as you do," continued the woman, her soft voice carrying the wisdom of years. "Sometimes pride is a wall we build so high that not even we ourselves can climb it." That night, after Mrs. Sophie departed, Howard received an unexpected visit. The hospital social worker, a woman of severe appearance but compassionate gaze, entered his room carrying a folder of documents. "Mr. Davis, we need to talk about your situation," she began, sitting in the chair beside the bed. "You're about to be discharged, but you don't have a fixed address or conditions to continue the treatment on your own." Howard felt his stomach sink. The prospect of returning to the streets, still weak and debilitated, was terrifying. "There are some shelters that can," she continued, but was interrupted by a familiar voice from the door. "He's not going to any shelter," said Barbara, his sister, standing at the entrance of the room. Her face was marked by deep circles under her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly while holding the strap of her expensive handbag. "Barbara?" Howard barely recognized his own voice, weak and insecure. "Mum is very sick," she said, entering the room with hesitant steps. "Since she learned you were living on the streets, that you almost died. She doesn't eat properly, doesn't sleep. The doctor said her heart is very weak." The weight of that revelation fell upon Howard like an avalanche. His mother, always so strong and proud, now wasting away because of him. "George still doesn't know I'm here," continued Barbara, referring to her husband. "He wouldn't approve, but you're still my brother." The social worker observed the scene in silence, her gaze alternating between the siblings. "There's an empty maid's room at the back of the house," Barbara spoke, her voice trembling. "It's not much, but—" "I can't accept," interrupted Howard, his wounded pride still fighting against necessity. "Your husband made it clear he doesn't want me around. And the children ask about Uncle Howard," she responded, a tear running down her made-up face. "Marina drew you the other day. Said she misses the stories you used to tell." The silence that followed was interrupted by a new coughing fit. When he managed to recover, Howard noticed that his sister had approached the bed, her expensive perfume mixing with the hospital smell. "I'm not asking, Howard," she said, her voice recovering some of the characteristic firmness of the Davises. "I'm demanding. You've already destroyed this family once with your pride. I won't let you do it again." The social worker cleared her throat, drawing the siblings' attention. "We need a fixed address to continue the treatment," she said. "And you'll need regular medical follow-up for the next few months." At that moment, hurried steps in the corridor announced the arrival of Richard Mitchell, again impeccable in his expensive suit. "What a coincidence finding you here." "Barbara," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes, "I came to deal with some pending matters with your brother." Barbara positioned herself between the bed and Richard, her posture completely changing. "Any matter you have with my brother will be dealt with through lawyers, Richard, and I suggest you choose your next actions carefully. We have a lot to lose, but so do you." Richard's smile faltered for an instant. He adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that Howard knew well from the times they worked together. "Just fulfilling my duty to the shareholders," he responded, retreating toward the door. "But we can discuss this another time." When Richard left, Barbara turned to her brother, her eyes now determined. "You're coming to my house as soon as you're discharged, and I don't want to hear another word about it. Mom needs to know it's okay that you're recovering." The social worker smiled discreetly as she noted the new address on her form. Howard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of tears he could no longer contain. Through the hospital window, the sky began to darken, and the city lights turned on one by one, like small earthly stars illuminating an uncertain path. The maid's room at the back of Barbara's house was small and simple, but to Howard, it represented an unimaginable luxury after weeks on the streets. A narrow bed, a modest wardrobe, and a small window overlooking the garden comprised the entire environment. The smell of clean clothes and the mattress, even though thin, seemed like paradise compared to the wet cardboard of the sidewalks. However, the new situation brought with it a different set of humiliations. George, Barbara's husband, barely disguised his discontent with his brother-in-law's presence. In the rare moments they crossed paths, he limited himself to a dry nod of the head, like someone acknowledging the existence of an uncomfortable piece of furniture in the house. "He's only staying until he completely recovers," Howard heard Barbara explain in whispers to her husband during a nighttime discussion. "I can't let Mom die of worry." "What about our reputation?" George rebutted, his voice loaded with bitterness. "People talk, Barbara. At the club, at work, everyone knows your brother is living in the back room like a—" The phrase was never completed, but its weight hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Howard made an effort to make himself invisible, avoiding the common areas of the house and leaving his room only when necessary. Meals were left by Maria, the maid, on a tray outside his door. The children, however, were different. Marina, his 8-year-old niece, frequently escaped her parents' vigilance to visit him. She would sit on the edge of his bed and ask for the stories he used to tell during family Christmases. "Uncle, why can't you live in that big house anymore?" she asked one afternoon, her innocent eyes piercing Howard's soul. "Sometimes we make mistakes, Princess," he responded, feeling his throat tighten, "and we need to learn from them." The visit that hurt the most, however, was his mother's. Mrs. Celia Davis, once a haughty and elegant lady, now seemed to have aged decades in just a few months. Her hands constantly trembled, and her eyes, once lively and assertive, carried a deep sadness that broke Howard's heart. "My son," she would say, seated in the only chair in the small room, "where did I go wrong? Perhaps if your father were alive—" "Oh, you didn't do anything wrong, Mum," Howard would interrupt, unable to bear the weight of guilt in his mother's eyes. "I'm the one who failed to honor the family name." Mrs. Sophie continued to be a constant presence in his life. Even with the move to Barbara's house, she made a point of visiting him regularly, bringing her treats and words of comfort. It was during one of those visits that she brought news of Luke. "The boy seems different," she commented, arranging a small basket of fruits on the improvised table. "The other day I saw him leaving that monastery near your old office. He seemed to be talking to a priest." The mention of the monastery made Howard remember his feverish deliriums in the hospital. The image of the illuminated windows returned, forcefully to his mind, but now seemed to carry a different meaning. One afternoon, while taking his medicines, Howard heard altered voices coming from the main house. George had discovered that Luke was regularly visiting the monastery, talking with a priest about the family situation. "That kid is going to end up telling everything to that priest," George vociferated. "Don't you realize the risk that represents? If someone discovers the details of what really happened with the companies—" "Lower your voice," Barbara whispered urgently. "The children might hear." Howard felt his heart accelerate. What did George know about the fall of the Davis Empire that he himself didn't know? What secrets were buried under the ruins of his old life? The answer came in the form of a brown envelope, discreetly delivered by Maria along with his dinner. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Not all is lost. There is evidence of what really happened. Father Paul awaits. You at the monastery. With trembling hands, Howard reread the message several times. The priest's name made his stomach turn. It was the same one he had encountered in his most desperate moments on the streets, whose words now returned with crystal clarity. Your redemption will come from the unexpected. Outside his room, night was falling over New York City, and the city lights began to shine. Somewhere among the buildings and avenues that were once his empire, a small monastery held secrets that could change everything. But Howard knew that each step toward the truth could cost him the only shelter he had left. The decision to visit. The monastery consumed Howard for days. Each time he gathered courage to leave, something stopped him. Sometimes the cough that still persisted, sometimes the fear of losing the shelter offered by his sister, sometimes the fear of what he might discover. George's words about the details of what really happened echoed in his mind like a somber presage. On a particularly cold morning, while taking his medicines, he heard a conversation between Barbara and Maria in the laundry room, close to his room. You won't believe it, whispered Maria, but Mrs. Christine called early this morning wanting to know how he is. Howard silently approached the door, his heart accelerating at hearing his ex-wife's name. And what did you say? Asked Barbara, her voice tense. Nothing, as you instructed, but she seemed nervous, said she needed to talk to him urgently. Something about documents she found in Mr. Richards' old office. Richards' name made Howard shudder. What documents would those be? What had Christine discovered? That same afternoon, breaking. Weeks of seclusion, Howard left Barbara's house. He wore simple clothes that his sister had bought, jeans, a polo shirt, and a light jacket. Nothing that resembled the executive he once was, but also nothing that identified him as the homeless person he had become. The path to the monastery was long, and each step seemed to carry the weight of his doubts. The streets of downtown New York City, which he once traversed only inside luxury cars, now told a different story. He recognized some faces, homeless people who had shared with him the most difficult nights of his life. The monastery was an old and discreet construction, squeezed between modern commercial buildings. Its stone walls contrasted with the glass and steel around it, like a silent testimony of a time that New York City seemed to have forgotten. At the entrance, a faded plaque indicated the mass schedules. Howard hesitated for a moment, his hand trembling as he touched the heavy wooden door. From the other side, soft voices intoned a Gregorian chant. I knew you would come, said a familiar voice. It was Father Paul, the same man who had approached him in his most desperate moments on the streets. His eyes, deep and serene, seemed to traverse Howard's soul. My son has been coming here, said Howard, his voice hoarse. Luke is a special boy, responded the priest, leading him to a small side room. He told me a lot about you, about your family, and about Richard Mitchell. The name made Howard instinctively cringe. Father Paul noticed his reaction and continued. 2 weeks ago, a woman came looking for me. Christine, your ex-wife. She found something while cleaning Richard's old office. Something that can change everything. The priest walked to a small desk and removed a brown envelope from a drawer. She asked me to keep this until finding the right moment to give it to you. With trembling hands, Howard opened the envelope. Inside, he found a series of documents, contracts, printed emails, financial reports. As he read, his face paled. This is... He could barely form the words. The proof that your downfall was meticulously planned, completed the priest. Richard didn't act alone. There was a larger scheme involving people you considered trustworthy. One name in particular jumped from the documents, making Howard's blood freeze in his veins. It was a name he knew well, too close to his family. The sound of hurried steps in the corridor interrupted the conversation. A nun appeared at the door, her face showing urgency. Father, there's someone looking for Mr. Howard. A man said it's urgent. Through the half-open door, Howard glimpsed a familiar figure in the monastery atrium. George, Barbara's husband, swept the environment with nervous eyes. "He can't find me here," whispered Howard, feeling panic grow. Father Paul quickly stored the documents in a different drawer. "There's an exit through the back, through the chapel. But you need to know, Howard, now that it's started, there's no turning back. Truth has a price, and some people will do anything to keep it buried." With his heart pounding in his chest, Howard followed the indicated exit. The Gregorian chant still echoed through the ancient walls, but now it sounded like a requiem for his brief peace in his sister's house. As he moved away through the back of the monastery, a certainty grew in his chest. The true test of his strength was just beginning. Night had already fallen when Howard finally stopped walking. His legs trembled, both from the physical effort and from the impact of the revelations contained in those documents. The name he had seen there, intertwined with Richard's in a web of betrayals, was like a dagger stuck in his chest. George, his own brother-in-law, had been involved from the beginning. He couldn't go back to Barbara's house, not now. His temporary shelter, that small back room that represented his last connection to family life, was lost. The irony didn't escape him. Again, he found himself without a roof, but this time by his own choice. His steps automatically led him to the small square where Mrs. Sophie used to sell her pastries. Even at that hour, she was still there, arranging her things to leave. "My God in heaven, Mr. Howard," she exclaimed upon seeing him. "What happened? Your sister is desperately looking for you." He collapsed on a nearby bench, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. With a trembling voice, he began to tell Mrs. Sophie everything he had discovered at the monastery. With each word, the woman's face transformed into a mask of indignation and sadness. "George was conspiring with Richard from the beginning," he explained, his voice breaking. "They planned everything for years. The documents show transfers, secret meetings, contract manipulation. George provided privileged information about the companies, data that only someone from the family would have access to." "But why?" asked Mrs. Sophie, sitting beside him. "Money, power. The documents show that George received a significant stake in the companies after they were taken from me. He and Richard divided the spoils of the empire my father built." Howard's cell phone, a basic model that Barbara had given him, began to ring. It was his sister. "Howard, for God's sake, where are you?" Barbara's voice sounded desperate. "George is distraught, said you've been snooping around, asking questions." "Barbara," he interrupted, feeling tears in his eyes. "Do you trust me?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "I need you to do something," he continued. "Go to George's office on his computer. Look for a folder called Project Phoenix. The password is Marina's birth date." "How do you know?" "It's all in the documents Christine found. Please, Barbara. You need to see for yourself." After a long moment of hesitation, Barbara responded in a weak voice, "All right, but promise you'll stay safe." After hanging up, Howard turned to Mrs. Sophie. "I need a place to spend the night." The woman smiled sadly. "My shack is small and simple, but there's room for one more." In Mrs. Sophie's humble home, a small dwelling in the outskirts of the city, Howard spent the night wide awake. His mind buzzed with the implications of what he had discovered. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The mysterious meetings George had at the office, the times he had caught him on the phone speaking in code, the way he always seemed to know details about the family business that he shouldn't know. Around 3 in the morning, his cell phone vibrated with a message from Barbara. "I found the folder. My God, Howard, how could he do this? How did I not notice?" Minutes later, another message arrived, this time from an unknown number. "The documents you saw are just the tip of the iceberg. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. at the cafe on the corner of the monastery, we need to talk. Christine." Howard reread the message several times, his heart beating fast. Christine had always been the most perceptive, the one who noticed things before everyone else. What more might she have discovered? The early morning was dragging on when he heard altered voices in the street. Cautiously approaching the window, he saw 2 men talking with neighbors, showing his photo on a cell phone. One of them he recognized. It was one of Richard's personal security guards. "They won't give up easily," murmured Mrs. Sophie, who was also observing the scene. People like that don't accept losing. Howard felt a chill run down his spine. What had begun as a search for answers was transforming into something much larger and more dangerous. Somewhere in the city, Christine kept more secrets that could expose the whole truth. But at what price? The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in pink hues when Howard made his decision. He would go to the meeting arranged by Christine, even knowing it could be a trap. He needed to know the whole truth, not just for himself, but for his family, for his son Luke, for all who had been deceived. "Are you sure, sir?" asked Mrs. Sophie, concern evident in her voice. "No," he responded, observing the day breaking over the city that was once his empire. "But sometimes we need to face our fears to find our redemption." The cafe on the corner of the monastery was a modest establishment, frequented mainly by employees of the region's offices. Howard arrived 10 minutes before the scheduled time, choosing a discreet table in the back from where he could observe both the entrance and the back exit. Wearing clothes borrowed from one of Mrs. Sophie's neighbors, a simple shirt and faded jeans, he barely resembled the businessman he once was, which served his purposes perfectly at that moment. A cup of simple coffee steamed in front of him, untouched. Christine entered punctually at 9 o'clock. The years of living together had not prepared Howard to see her like this. Her face was marked by deep circles under her eyes, and her hair, always impeccably arranged, was tied in a careless bun. She carried a brown folder similar to the one Father Paul had shown him. "You look terrible," were her first words as she sat down. "You're not at your best either," he responded, trying to keep the tone light, but his voice betrayed the tension of the moment. Christine looked nervously around before continuing. "Luke told me about your visit to the monastery, about the documents, but there's more, Howard, much more." She opened the folder and began to take out papers, spreading them discreetly on the table. After everything happened, I started working as an executive assistant in Richard's office. He would never imagine that the ex-wife of the man he destroyed could still represent any threat." Howard examined the documents with growing attention. They were emails, contracts, financial reports, all pointing to a scheme, much larger than he had imagined. "It wasn't just George," explained Christine, her voice trembling slightly. "Richard built an entire network of people inside the companies, infiltrated over the years. Each one had a specific role in the plan, to take control of everything." "But why?" asked Howard, though he already suspected the answer. "Your father," she responded, confirming his suspicions. "Before dying, he discovered something about Richard, something big enough to destroy him. Instead of denouncing him, your father decided to keep the information as a guarantee, ensuring that Richard remained loyal to the company." Howard's heart accelerated. "The safe in the office." "Exactly." Christine took out another document from the folder. "Your father left specific instructions that the safe should only be opened in case of his death by unnatural causes. Richard knew this. He spent years planning, putting people in strategic positions, including George, waiting for the right moment. And I facilitated everything," murmured Howard, the realization hitting him like a punch. "My arrogance, my carelessness with business. They just waited for you to make enough mistakes to justify the takeover," confirmed Christine. "But there's something they don't know." At that moment, Christine's cell phone vibrated. She looked at the screen and her face paled. "We need to get out of here now," she said, beginning to hurriedly collect the documents. "What is it?" "Richard discovered that the documents are missing. He's on his way to the office, and when he realizes they're not there." A noise of sudden braking in the street caught the attention of both. Through the cafe's window, they saw a black car park. George exited from the passenger seat. "The back exit," whispered Christine, already standing. But before they could move, the cafe door opened. It wasn't George who entered, but Luke. The boy seemed out of breath, as if he had been running. "Dad!" he called, loud enough for everyone in the cafe to turn. "Father Paul, he sent a warning. They're coming." George entered right after, his face contorted in a mask of fury upon seeing the scene before him. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. Howard and Christine still standing, Luke in the middle of the cafe, George blocking the entrance. It was then that a familiar voice sounded from the back door. "This way, quick." It was Mrs. Sophie urgently waving. The priest opened the passage through the monastery. Howard grabbed the folder with the documents and, together with Christine and Luke, ran toward the back exit. Behind them, George's voice thundered threats, mixed with the sound of chairs being knocked over. As they ran through the back corridors of the cafe, Howard firmly held his son's hand. Somehow, in the midst of all that chaos, a certainty began to form in his mind. The truth, no matter how much they tried to bury it, always found a way to come to light. The corridors of the monastery seemed like a labyrinth of stone and shadows, as Howard, Christine, and Luke followed Mrs. Sophie through narrow passages. The sound of their steps echoed off the ancient walls, mixing with the distant chant of monks in prayer. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers were growing more and more distant. "This way," indicated Father Paul, emerging from a side door. His normally serene face now showed urgency. In the chapel. The monastery chapel was a small and welcoming environment, illuminated by the soft light that traversed the colored stained glass. On the altar, a single lit candle flickered, projecting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The group entered quickly, and the priest closed the heavy door behind them. "Here you'll be safe for now," he said, heading to a wooden panel on the wall. With a smooth movement, he revealed an ancient hidden chamber. This place has guarded secrets for centuries. Inside the chamber, to everyone's surprise, was Barbara. Her eyes were red from crying, but her posture demonstrated an iron determination. "I'm sorry," she said, looking directly at her brother. "Sorry for not believing you before, for allowing George—" "It's not your fault," interrupted Howard, hugging his sister. "He deceived all of us." "Not all of us," a new voice sounded from the chamber entrance. It was Mrs. Celia Davis, the matriarch of the Davis family, supported by two nuns. Her face, though tired, showed a renewed strength. "Your father knew. He always knew." Luke helped his grandmother sit in an old wooden chair. Mrs. Davis took a yellowed envelope from her purse. "Anthony, your father, left this with me before he died," she explained, her hands trembling slightly as she handed the envelope to her son. "He made me promise to only deliver it when it was absolutely necessary, when you hit rock bottom and found your way back." Howard opened the envelope carefully. Inside, besides documents and old photographs, there was a handwritten letter from his father. "My son," he began to read aloud, his voice breaking with emotion, "if you are reading this, it's because you finally learned the most important lesson that I couldn't teach you in life, that the true value of a man lies not in what he possesses, but in what he is capable of losing and still remaining intact." His father's words continued, revealing how he had discovered years before a corruption scheme involving Richard. Instead of denouncing him, Anthony Davis had kept the evidence, using it to keep Richard under control, hoping that his son would mature enough to take command of the companies. "But I failed," murmured Howard, tears now freely running down his face. "I wasted everything he built." "No," intervened Mrs. Sophie, her voice gentle but firm. "You needed to lose everything to find what really matters." The sound of footsteps in the corridor made everyone quiet. The chapel door opened, revealing Richard and George, followed by two security guards. "It's over," said Richard, his face contorted in a mask of arrogance. "You have nowhere to go." "On the contrary," responded Father Paul, his voice calm. "It's you who have nowhere to run anymore, Richard." The priest made a sign, and from the shadows of the chapel emerged two men in well-cut suits, showing federal police badges. "Richard Mitchell," announced one of them. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and various other financial crimes. We have all the necessary evidence." "Impossible!" shouted Richard, his face losing all color. "How?" "The evidence was here all along," explained Mrs. Davis. "Anthony entrusted everything to the church, knowing that one day the truth would need to come to light." George tried to run but was quickly detained. As the officers led the two out of the chapel, Howard felt a small hand hold his. It was Luke. "Dad," said the boy, his eyes shining with contained tears, "can we start over?" Howard looked around. The chapel, at his mother, strong even in her fragility. At Barbara, who had finally freed herself from a marriage built on lies. At Christine, who had never stopped believing in the truth. at Mrs. Sophie, the guardian angel who had saved him from the streets, at Father Paul, silent guardian of so many secrets. "Yes, son," he responded, pulling Luke into a tight hug. "We already have." 3 months later, the Davis Empire was being rebuilt, this time on more solid foundations. Howard didn't return to his luxury penthouse or his imported cars. Instead, he chose a simpler life, living in a modest house with Luke and dedicating part of his recovered resources to helping homeless people. Every Thursday, he and Luke had dinner with Mrs. Sophie in her small house on the outskirts of the city. She always made a point of cooking that same pastry she had offered Howard in his most difficult moment. Not because they needed it, but to remember that sometimes the simplest gestures can change a person's destiny. And in the monastery, where everything began to resolve, Father Paul continued receiving people in search of redemption, always repeating the same words he had once said to Howard. "Your redemption will come from the unexpected, and only when everything seems lost will you see the light." Howard had finally understood. Sometimes it's necessary to lose everything, to find what really matters. His story, which had begun as a tragedy of loss and betrayal, had transformed into a testimony of redemption and new beginnings, proving that even in the darkest nights, there is always a path back to the light.